And the idea behind this product is that it's one of a kind of suite of menu options that the Bay program has been putting out in terms of communication materials to help engage local areas on Phase 3 WIP. So our communication team has put together a whole series of fact sheets and presentation templates on a number of the pieces, like planning targets, like the model, and then this product kind of takes a bunch of those pieces and puts them together in one place, and then presents it in kind of a more visual and interactive way. So the idea is that this product would be one of a suite of many communications products that our partners in the state agencies, as well as our other partners like Choose Clean Water Coalition, could use during their engagement to kind of just give a baseline of here's where this is all coming from and why it connects to local areas. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to John and let him walk you through the really neat tool that he's put together.
Okay, thanks, Emily. Well, as Emily mentioned, there's actually a couple of different versions of this, and they basically have the same content. They just have a little bit different navigation and some of the functionality. So the URL that was sent out with the agenda is actually not the one I'm going to go through today, but
sorry, John.
That's okay. I will send out the updated URL of what I'm sharing today, and then we would very much appreciate any feedback. This is a draft product, and it continues to evolve, and so anyway, that's kind of from the technical side. It is a story map, and in terms of navigating this, if you have a mouse, you can scroll with your mouse wheel to get through this story, and then there are various maps and things that you can interact with along the way if you so choose. You don't have to, and I'll just highlight some of those. So as Emily mentioned, the idea here is to make connections from local areas throughout the Bay watershed to water quality conditions in the Chesapeake Bay, and why these are inextricably are linked together. And so if you start by just imagining that say you're an environmental planner in a county in, say, Pennsylvania, maybe Lancaster County, maybe somewhere else. So your focus is primarily on what the conditions of the environment are locally, and particularly from a water perspective. What are the conditions of the streams and waterways in my jurisdiction? So I might want to be interested in, what are the designated uses, and you guys are familiar with that term, I'm sure, for the streams and waterways in my area. So so the tool gives you the ability to actually drill down into streams and waterways in the area. You can explore the map if you would so choose and find out information about particular locations. Here I am just southwest of Lancaster, and I can click on a map and figure out, well, what's the designated use there? In that case, trout streams, trout stocking. So that's one thing. That's what it should be, but as we know, not all waterways are meeting their designated uses, and under the 303D part of the Clean Water Act, we have impairments. So some are impaired, some are meeting their standards, so that gives you some insight on a local level as to what's important and what the status is in terms of being able to reach those designated uses. So that's key, but if I'm a local planner, I'm not just concerned about water quality in the Bay or in my local waterways. I'm concerned about other things. It might be flooding or stormwater. So the idea here is maybe there are other geospatial data sets that you might want to bring to bear to get a more comprehensive view of conditions in your local jurisdiction. And again, this is actually just showing, I believe, MS4 permit areas, if you will, which focuses on stormwater. So you have local impairments that might be caused by different problems. You can, in this case, drill into the streams and get the indication. I kind of skipped over that, but if you're looking at what those impairments might be, you can get some ideas to what the problems might be in a given area. In this case, I'm looking at, so has an assessed use for the aquatic life. It's impaired, and it might be because of agricultural crop nutrients, could be because of other problems and so forth. So the idea is wherever you are, you can drill into the area to find out what the problems are and then how that might relate to other issues that are important. So that's great, but we're here to talk about the Chesapeake Bay. So as we continue to scroll through this this application, we get a map of the Chesapeake Bay watershed here. And so in this case, we might be focusing in on, again, let's go into that area that is near Lancaster and say, okay, well, I just saw that this waterway is impaired, and I'm probably not picking the same one, but the idea is, okay, well, it's not only impaired, but there's a pathway that takes you to the Chesapeake Bay from that area. So there's a connection in terms of the local conditions to the conditions in the bay itself. And so this little application that's embedded in the story map, it's a USGS tool, but it works throughout the watershed. Let's say you're in upstate New York and you're going to the Little League World Series in Cooperstown, and so you can also find out the connection from anywhere in the watershed in terms of how that flow and what happens locally ultimately can impact the conditions in the Chesapeake Bay. So that's sort of the transition to now looking at the bay itself. So we're concerned about the conditions in the bay and why. Okay, so if you think of if you're in upstate or in New York or in upstate Pennsylvania, you may not really understand what the big deal is. So we have these important resources that are recreationally important, ecologically important, and economically important. So the idea is to basically introduce some of these important resources in the Chesapeake Bay to folks working throughout the watershed. And not unlike what we have with local conditions and designated uses, there's designated uses in the Chesapeake Bay. It's a little bit more complicated because it's an estuary, and we have freshwater mixing with saltwater, and things change at different times of the year, different seasons. Conditions might change in terms of the picnic line or the area where the fresh and salt water are mixing. So there's a lot of work has been done to establish designated uses in these different zones of the bay in terms of how they would support different types of living resources. And as an example, continue to scroll down, we're going to look at aquatic life in the bay and some of their dissolved oxygen requirements. So we have finfish and shellfish, and they have different dissolved oxygen requirements to make sure that they can survive at all times of the year. And those DO requirements in particular are important to determine if water quality standards are being met. And that actually introduces the next concept, which deals more with assimilative capacity, if you will. So we know the bay is polluted from too many nutrients and sediment. And the question is how much nutrient pollution can occur without running into problems with respect to providing a healthy enough ecosystem for living resources to live. So that concept is fairly important when we talk about the pollution diet for the bay, because we need to know how much can it absorb and still support these living resources. But once that's known, and you guys know this, we have a relatively sophisticated suite of models that look at not only the conditions in the bay, but the impacts within the watershed that affect those conditions. And so there's some graphics here that talk about the importance of geography in terms of the bay maintaining its water quality standards. And we know there's a need to clean up some of our terminology. When we deal with the modelers, they get a little carried away. But in a nutshell, this is looking at the watershed model and looking at the relative impact or effectiveness of places throughout the watershed in terms of the water quality conditions in the main stem of the bay, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But it's basically showing the over 2,000 segments of the watershed model and looking at the effectiveness of transport of nutrients. And we talk about all else, that's actually basically the non-point source contributions. And so the user can, if they choose, they can zoom in or they can look at individual segments and see, what is the effectiveness of transport in this case, nitrogen non-point source from my area, from my neck of the woods. And again, you can zoom in and look at different places. But if I continue to scroll down here, I'll go from non-point source to the wastewater sector. And so now we're looking at the role of wastewater treatment plants in the same kind of form with respect to total nitrogen. And continuing to scroll, you get a different story with respect to phosphorus from non-point source as well as from point source. Okay, so that's model world, trying to link the source and the sector to the ultimate effect in terms of water quality in the bay. And so that actually is sort of at the heart of the TMDL and how allocations are made. So we know the impact on water quality in the estuary. We know the sources of nutrients from relatively small areas throughout the watershed. How do we divide up the responsibility for the cleanup so that we meet that pollution diet? And so those planning targets or planning goals are aggregated to these major state basins. This is what EPA basically hands the states, and so you have to come to a nutrient reduction for this geographic area, and it's up to you to figure out how those planning targets are broken out. So continuing on with the planning targets idea, this is a little graphic that shows the relative impacts or the relative roles of different watersheds or the major state basins in terms of the nitrogen and phosphorus pollution diet by basin. So this is a draft of the Phase 6 planning targets, and the user can just scroll over different areas to explore their area of interest in more detail. Okay, so we sort of made that connection from local problems to the bay problem, and now we have allocations at the major state basin throughout the watershed. Now we're going to go back into the local areas where a lot of those decisions are made, where the rubber meets the road, if you will. And the idea here is that there are a variety of practices, best management practices that are important in terms of protecting local waterways, but are also important in terms of keeping track of progress towards cleaning up the bay. And so this is an example of a dashboard that Maryland has. They call it their WIP dashboard. It's basically tracking various best management practices over time and space. So in this case, we're looking at grass buffers and the progress they're making annually and cumulatively in grass buffers, and also in the context of where it's happening in the counties in Maryland. So this is one example. It's certainly not the only example, but the idea is that this issue is sort of a quantity issue as well as a quality. So one is counting acres of BMPs that are put into place, but there are also recognition that different BMPs have different efficiencies in terms of the reduction in nutrients and sediment. So this is more the quality side of things. We have the quantity of counting acres of various BMPs, and then we also recognize the quality that some BMPs are more effective than others in nutrient and sediment trapping. So this is a sample graphic that's intended to get at that efficiency of by BMPs. Probably end up replacing that with another example. So anyway, still at the local level, we realize that there are other things going on besides tracking progress towards nutrient reductions to the bay. And so this is a table that's actually trying to illustrate the concept of co-benefits. And you know, we have the Bay Watershed Agreement that has 10 goals and 31 outcomes. And the idea here is that you may be taking actions locally that are removing nutrients and sediment, but they also have benefit to other business cases of the Bay program. And so for these various BMPs, you might look at, oh, I don't know, let's look at brook trout. And so these BMPs that are being credited with nutrient reductions are also valuable for these other outcomes. And in this case, we're looking at, okay, some of the most valuable BMPs for brook trout are, as you would expect, things like ag forest buffers and ag stream restoration, tree planting, and so forth. So this is just a way to bring in the other outcomes and the other potential benefits, a couple different ways of looking at it. If I want to look at, say, the agricultural sector and the effects of ag-forest buffers, so not only can I get a feel for what the nutrient sediment reductions based on the efficiencies of that particular BMP, but there are other ways to score that BMP relative to the other outcomes in the Bay Watershed Agreement. So we have co-benefits, we have efficiency on a BMP by BMP basis, we have the accounting of acres of BMPs. So collectively that brings us back to sort of the story, the local waterways story, and the idea being, okay, you put all these things in place with the goal that we are removing things from the dirty waters list, if you will, going from impaired to healthy at the local level, and that those local actions, those BMPs, are linked to the activities and the accounting framework for progress towards achieving the goals of the TMDL in the main stem of the bay. And so over time, the more of those local BMPs that are put into place, the more we're going to see a reduction and a return to meeting designated uses, and this is looking at the deep channel water quality standards in the bay, which is the most difficult area to attain in terms of water quality standards. But as over time more and more of these BMPs are put into place, we should see the restoration of those segments in terms of meeting water quality standards. So again, the goal is to try to link and show this relationship both between the local waterways in the bay and vice versa through this story map, which has interactivity, and it's fairly high level, but the goal is to just show some of those higher level linkages through a relatively easy to navigate tool. So that's all I have. We can open it up for questions or comments.
Jen, this is Emily. I'm just going to add one thing too. Thanks so much for walking through that. I actually haven't seen it. I haven't seen you present it all the way through before. It looks amazing. But we have been working really closely with the communications team here at the Bay Program to go through, as well as with the local government advisory committee at the Bay Program, to go through a lot of the text and kind of the descriptions and the guidance that's in there. They had some great suggestions on how to make it a little bit more navigable, so it's, you don't have to go through the whole thing in sequential order if you don't want to. So I just wanted to add that we are working actively with them. Like John said, this is a draft, and so we're getting some really good feedback on a lot of the changes to text and whatnot that we can make to make it more digestible for the audience that's intended.
Emily, can you remind me what the audience is for this?
Yeah, sure. So what we heard back from the Water Quality GIT was that they really needed something to help with local engagement. So what you can imagine is there's kind of two different audiences. One would be the people that are using this to actually bring out to local stakeholders, and then the end kind of audience are local stakeholders, whether it's municipalities or whatever kind of local level folks are dealing with. So the people we would imagine using this as one of many communications tools or one of many communications options would be the folks in the state agencies that are doing local engagement for the WIPs, or other partners that are doing any sort of local engagement around the WIPs and want something to kind of help put in the local stakeholders' hands to kind of explain where this is all coming from. And then kind of the end audience, at the end of the day, that's digesting all of it, would be more of those local stakeholders and local partners that are being reached out to and asked to do things for WIP development.
Right. Oh, that's awesome. Okay. Anyone have any questions?
This is John. I'm actually putting the URL in the chat box if anybody wants to look at it.
Perfect. So I think this is really helpful because, I mean, when I talk to some of our partners in New York, they're having trouble sort of connecting their public and their residents mindsets with how their water quality impacts the bay. And so I think this could be really helpful and particularly in headwaters states, especially in New York. So I loved the Cooperstown example. I'm sure Peter appreciated it too. Because what is it, the Baseball Hall of Fame is there? I think so.
Yes, it is.
That's where all the Yankees are.
Okay. Well, does anyone have any questions for John or Emily?
This is Jennifer. I do. This is Jennifer Herzog with the Land Trust Alliance. Just a question about, and I'm sorry if I missed this earlier, but is ultimately, do you have a goal of getting specific projects sort of added to the story map, or is there some way you want to populate this with actions on the ground, sort of beyond what you've already got identified under the local solutions kind of tab of the story map, and how can we help, if so?
I would think that what you're describing is very much of interest, and not only in terms of this particular project, but in terms of tracking progress towards any number of, in your case, land preservation objectives. I don't think that this story map is actually the vehicle to capture all of that, but we certainly have other activities in the Healthy Watersheds arena with the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership in terms of the Land Trust Alliance's data and projects that we would be interested in talking to you further about it if you have not already been engaged in some of those activities. But this story map is intended to be sort of a high-level piece that isn't really intended to be the repository of all important data.
Okay, so this is just, it kind of, as it's built now, that kind of stands on its own as a way for people to sort of enter, in a way, sort of enter the watershed and understand how all of the aspects work together, what the sort of ecology and nutrient delivery of the bay looks like, and how the whole watershed is connected, and it kind of stands on its own in that respect.
I think that's a better description than I could have provided.
Okay. Now I'm just curious if there's a next step of the story map, or if this is just something that helps people understand their place, which I think is very important as well. As Shantae mentioned, I could see it being very useful with land trusts too, who are thinking more and more about water and could use something like this to understand how it's all connected. So thanks.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think you put it correctly for kind of what the purpose of this particular product is. One of the things that we were running into, especially say in some of the headwater states, was Pennsylvania, for example, is doing their local engagement at the county level, and when they first started going in and talking to folks at that level, it was there were a whole range of familiarity with the bay and with the TMDL, and there were a lot of people that were like, what is this number? Where is it coming from? What does this have to do with me? And what does it have to do with the bay? And so we were hoping that something like this could help answer some of those questions for those sorts of audiences that are, they're being engaged with to do something kind of around Phase 3 WIP development, but may not have that kind of full understanding of where it's all coming from.
Yep. Great. Thanks.
Cool. Any other questions?
This is Emily again. I'll also say, if this is, I think some of the feedback we'd love to get, we can definitely get over email as well. So if you want to take a look at it a little more and just send comments or suggestions to either me or John, that would be great. You can take a little bit more of a dive into it and look at it. If it is something that you think would be useful, for any of your work, then we'd love to get, suggestions on ways to improve it as we go through these drafts. If you think that it could be useful if some changes were made, we'd love to hear that information too. So feel free to, take a little bit of time to look through it and just send John or I any comments or feedback.
Yeah, and I would encourage folks to think about how this could work in your watershed, in your state and your jurisdiction with your members, and provide feedback based on that. Any other questions, concerns, comments? All right. Well, John, Emily, thank you so much for joining today. We super appreciate you going through the webinar and giving us all of this information. As a reminder, if you have any comments or feedback, please email John and Emily. I will make sure to send out the updated URL and copy them on the minutes when I send out the minutes after this so that you have their email addresses and contact information. So thanks, John and Emily. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Talk to you later.